Well, hello, wherever you are in this beautiful world, from the mountains to the prairies, from our homes and native lands, and in places where the trains always run on time, and of course in places where they never ever do. My name is Jeff Bartow, and I'm a trust strategist here at DigiCert, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion on the topic of compliance. As you'll hear and see today from our panel of experts, there is way more to do with digital certificates than merely encrypting web traffic as it moves, especially regarding the utility of validated identities. And you'll also learn from these experts about the constant change across multiple business ecosystems, and not just security, but healthcare and payments and more. It is our solemn responsibility to either lead or serve you from the very heart of those changes, so that you can in turn project fundamental trust on a very threat-filled internet. Hence, we offer discussions like this free of charge to fulfill our role of industry leadership. So, what is all this change, especially in terms of compliance? Now, global digitization has changed the way that the world does business, creating new avenues for connection and expansion that are open 24/7, 365. For instance, by 2021, e-commerce sales are predicted to surpass $4.5 trillion US. That's trillion with a T. Now, this is more than just a trend. This is now the new norm. This is the new now. And although this speed of global digital growth is obviously good for business, it also comes at a price. And that price is an increase in potentially costly risks that can put your organization in jeopardy. Now, as these global connections grow stronger, so do the risks. The number and the complexity and the consequences of cyber attacks are steadily increasing. And in response, we've seen a new and tighter standards and a rise in those standards, plus regulations and audits, all regarding cybersecurity. And organizations which try to keep up by maintaining cybersecurity compliance can face complexity and confusion, and never mind serious and far-reaching legal and financial risks if things don't work out. So it's no wonder that compliance can feel like a double-edged sword. I mean, sure, compliance helps keep your business and customers from cybercrime, but on the other hand, it equally demands complexity in IT and information security. Now, unless you're an expert in each area of compliance applicable to your organization, you run the risk of not being compliant and all of the uncomfortable business situations which would result. So let's look at this. Compliance concerns are some of the most consistent questions that we get from our customers. So we've assembled 4 subject matter experts, and they're here to cover the top compliance topics from which we've heard about from you. So we're going to cover these topics, which are GDPR, PCI, HIPAA, and additionally, how to structure effective corporate compliance programs. Now, before we dive into all of that, let's take care of some housekeeping, shall we? First, this discussion won't just be between me and our panelists. You're welcome to join in, and you'll do so by using the BrightTalk interface to submit any questions that you have. And please do it the moment that they pop into your mind. Now, if we wrap up our discussion on time, that's going to leave us with plenty of time to take your questions live afterward. Second, please continue this conversation with your account managers and security specialists and all the others supporting you across DigiCert's sales and product and authentication and marketing organizations. Now, third, we are recording this entire discussion, which will be made available after we conclude today. We encourage you to share it with your colleagues who couldn't join us today simply by sharing the link that got you here in the first place. Now, last, please rate today's discussion. Please also supplement your ratings with comments, because we rely on your feedback to consistently improve our communications with you. Okay, so now without further ado, let's introduce our panelists for today. We have Brenda and Greg and Mark and Ben, and they will help us make sense of the trending topics related to cybersecurity compliance. So a round of introductions is, of course, in order, and we're going to do ladies first. So Brenda, if you'd kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, my name is Brenda Burnell, and I'm the Global Director of Policy and Compliance, formerly of Symantec's Website Security and PKI business, now part of DigiCert. Our organization has been subject to many of these compliance imperatives, including PCI, which you'll hear about today. When at the onset of our compliance journey, we focused on data protection and safe harbor laws, which were great springboards into GDPR.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Greg Koss. I'm a Senior Director of Infrastructure and Security for Cybersource. Cybersource is the merchant-facing side of Visa Incorporated, and in my role, I'm in charge of making sure that our systems and infrastructure are very resistant to compromise, ensure that we're compliant, not just with PCI, but because of who we are in the industry, our own internal standards, where we are essentially thought leaders and practitioners in this space.
Hi, I'm Mark Urban, excuse me, the Vice President of Product Strategy and Operations for Symantec. In my work, I work with large enterprises on cybersecurity strategies, architecting infrastructure for better resiliency and effectiveness to protect information and ward off cyber attacks.
Hi, I'm Ben Wilson. I'm Vice President of Compliance at DigiCert. I'm also an attorney, and I've over the years advised clients and internal clients as well on compliance issues and on legal issues and on various industry regulatory matters. And I'm glad to be here today.
Well, I'm glad all of you are here, and thank you for joining us. This is fantastic. We are all now on a first-name basis, and you've seen the names and associated them with faces. This is fantastic. So we're going to start with probably the compliance topic, which is getting the most press lately, and that is the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, and it's also known as the GDPR. Now, there's only a handful of months before the GDPR becomes enforced, and although it's a Europe-centered regulation, it will affect organizations around the world, all of whom must consider how its far-reaching changes will affect how they handle and protect personal data. So we're going to begin here with our first panelist, and that is Brenda. So Brenda, a load of questions for you. GDPR seems to be the new buzzword. I can't open my browser or my email without hearing about it every single day. I like to use Monty Python quote, "What's all this then? What's it about?"
Well, I think the buzz is, well, first of all, I think data protection and privacy is nothing new. It's something we've wrestled with over the years. But I think with this new regulation that's coming into the forefront emanating from the EU, the hype is really around the repercussions of not being compliant.
Okay.
There are stiff fines associated with infringement or non-compliance that companies need to be prepared for. So a lot of the ramp up right now is assessing your ability to comply, and I would surmise that most businesses are not ready yet.
Yikes. Okay, then you're going to get some questions certainly about that. First things first, GDPR, does this only apply to organizations that are located in the EU?
It does not. This GDPR affects every business who interacts and does business with EU customers and businesses, no matter where you are or no matter where they are.
Okay, great. Then looking not geographically, let's look at this by business size. Does GDPR only apply to the big organizations, the multinationals, or does it apply to small businesses likewise?
It affects all types or categories of businesses, whether they're enterprise, small, medium business, mid-market, as long as you are dealing with EU customers and businesses, no matter where you are, you have a presence somewhere that is interacting with them, you are subject to GDPR.
Yikes, effectively, if you're online, it sounds like you need to pay attention.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. If you can give me some insight into the challenges of GDPR compliance and audits, that'd be right.
Yeah, there is no defined audit per se at the moment, but anytime, however, the EU regulators ask for information about how you as a business is handling personal data that's subject to the regulation, you must comply and provide the information that they need. So that means the level of understanding and readiness over your process and systems, and you know what agreements are in place, in some cases as a business, because it affects the B2B relationship as well. your customers may want the right to audit, which we've tackled in the past,
Okay.
because they want to be able to know that their shared provider or their third parties that they deal with can also comply.
Right, and if I understand correctly, it's hurry. The deadline's around the corner. Is given the time between now and then, fast track would be the word. What could organizations do for preparedness and also prevention of being called upon, hey, I need to see this detail?
I'd say first and foremost is know your data, understand what you're collecting, why you have it, what's your legitimate reason for collecting that information.
Yes.
What and how is it stored? How is it protected? How is it transmitted? And it's understanding whether it's in the purview of GDPR. So understanding how you use that information and how you're handling is key, very key.
Okay.
Because it helps you get through some of the questions that may be asked. And there's certain concepts or key things that are focus for GDPR. For example, the right to be forgotten, which means you have to completely wipe out the person's data upon request. And also data breach. We've dealt with data breaches as a security company, but it's the level of notification that needs to happen within 72 hours.
Wow, that's a fast
Otherwise, there are fines associated with that.
Yikes, okay.
And Jeff, it's May 25th is the deadline, so
Okay.
it's coming up pretty quickly. That's when you need to have your procedures, and you need to have gone through an analysis of the data flows and get ready for for this deadline. And even then, a lot of companies aren't going to be ready, but they should be in the process of getting ready and doing all these things so that they can show good faith in case they do get.
I was just going to ask, does work towards being compliance and ready count? And it sounds like it
Yes,
does.
yes,
Okay.
it does.
Excellent. You caught my attention with one thing that I want to ask about before we move onward in the discussion, and that is you piqued my interest with the right to be forgotten.
Yeah, it's a catchy phrase, isn't it?
It certainly
the right
is.
to be
Does
forgotten.
that apply only to people living in the EU, or can I, an American, say, I want to be forgotten and claim it from the standpoint of, well, you got to do that for GDPR?
Right now, you can invoke it as part of GDPR if you're the subject of GDPR.
Okay.
But it's the level of effort that a business needs to understand. What would it take to wipe this person completely? And it includes not just like immediately what's online, but also what's stored over years.
Right.
So
Wow.
that's if you don't have a way of degaussing this information quickly and understanding where it is, what forms it's stored in, then that's important as part of your preparedness steps.
Okay. And again, 5/25 or May 25th is coming up awfully fast. So I want to move on to the last thing, and that is if. Let me say it this way. Here at DigiCert, we deal obviously in digital certificates, but we're very concerned about the roles of encryption and identity. What would be the role of digital certificates, especially for encryption and identity, in preparing for GDPR and being compliant with it?
Sure. GDPR requires that the legislation requires that there are great, strong business measures in place, strong technical and organizational measures to protect the data that you have in your possession. So data encryption is a strong security measure and a good safeguard to have in place. It's important to note that it's also a good defense to prevent attempted data breaches, right? From doing any more harm. So as I mentioned, data breach notification is a key focus for GDPR. So encryption is important in protecting the information. Pretend you're possibly in the experiencing a data breach. Well, encryption will help in the sense that you can prevent the attacker from turning the information into intelligible information because they must decrypt it to make some sense of it. So it reduces the risk, right? Okay. So this can easily, this can't easily be done when you have strong encryption, if for them to actually make use of the information.
Okay. And the information is just data and characters and bits, unless there's a value to it, which seems to be the focus of a lot of breaches and attacks. So it's good to hear that dynamic there. That actually gives me a useful segue from moving from GDPR to our next topic, which is the payment card industry's data security standard, or the PCI DSS for short. So if you hear me saying DSS, now you know what I'm referring to. Now, Both the GDPR and the PCI DSS aim to ensure that organizations secure personal data. The GDPR, as you've heard, focuses on European residents' personal data and then expands outward from there, while the PCI DSS focuses on payment card and cardholder data worldwide. Now, they're both concerned with protecting consumers' information, but the important difference is that the GDPR is less prescriptive than the DSS. So for the details behind that, we're going to fire some questions towards Greg from Visa. Greg, my first question for you is just the centering on the whole topic. What is the PCI DSS, and why should online merchants be aware or even care?
Well, I mean, if you are any entity, whether you're a company, a nonprofit, a government organization, and you take payment through payment cards, you already have brushed up against PCI DSS. PCI DSS, as you said, is the most prescriptive. I would argue it's the most mature set of standards for protecting data. But to be perfectly honest, all the largest breaches that have happened in the world where payment card information was involved were PCI DSS compliant. So it's not a panacea. It is insurance, and it is a standard, and it is very, very good, but it's not a guarantee. So in the world of PCI DSS, you should care about it because you have payment data. You should care about it because it is the best way for you to protect your data as an institution, and it is the best way to have a mature set of processes around maintaining that over time.
Okay, got it. Based on your answer, I would be thinking if it's the best to do this, an organization's going to want to. They're interested in doing so, especially when the kind of information that's being acquired out there through a breach or loss. What would be the most critical challenges that an organization would face in implementing the DSS then?
I mean, really, as an organization, you have to be honest with yourself. I mean, if you talk to some people, they complain vociferously about PCI DSS. It's expensive, it's disruptive, it makes it harder for me to do my business. We've heard all of that, but it's right up there with, when my son complains about when I tell him to eat foods that I think are healthy for him, right? There's a maturity that goes along with it that is necessary to embrace PCI DSS. If it is ultimately a competitive advantage, it is ultimately a way for our entire industry to reduce risk for all of us, which drives down the cost of taking payment. Right. So it's, on the one hand, you have to comply with PCI DSS as an individual, but as an industry, if everybody's doing that, it's almost a herd resistance, because it drives down risk for everybody, it drives down the cost for everybody. So on the one hand, you're in this as an individual company. On the other hand, you're taking payment cards, so we're all in this together.
Absolutely. You mentioned some very key words there that I wrote down. Complaining, disruption, it's hard to do, and we get it. I mean, we all are employed by organizations. So given what you just said, there's obviously going to be some benefits. Aside from, it helps in your security posture, what are those benefits?
So the old axiom where, two guys are in the woods being chased by a bear? And you don't have to be faster than the bear, you just have to be faster than the other guy?
That's right.
All right, well, that applies in every risk scenario. So, if you manage your PCI DSS compliance, you are going to be a relatively hard target. Okay. So the hacker that's chasing you, the malicious actor that's chasing you, is probably going to leave you alone because you're a harder target than someone that doesn't do PCI DSS. Right. So that's in simplistic terms, that's really the basis of it.
And there's am I reading correctly that there's kind of a deterrence factor here?
Yes.
Okay.
You want to be a hard target, do your PCI DSS. Where you think appropriate, you can exceed what PCI DSS tells you need to do, because you do your own risk assessment and say, well, I'm going to spend a little more here because I think this is important. But at the end of the day, PCI DSS is a baseline, and then you invest in your hardening and your resistance where you think it's appropriate for your business.
Fantastic. Okay. You were a member of the PCI Special Interest Group that helped form the latest updates to the DSS. do you have recommendations that you'd like to make to e-commerce merchants who wish to be compliant?
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that e-commerce is a rapidly expanding segment. There's a tremendous amount of business, and of course, with size comes risk.
Right.
With complexity comes risk. So some of the ways that you can reduce the cost and the risk and the complexity of aspects of your business is going to vendors that have off-the-shelf solutions that are proven. And of course, certificates are, absolutely one of those kinds of technologies. And the services around managing certificates is a very proven set of technologies, and it's pervasive, it's easy to use, and as a security bulwark, it's pretty inexpensive.
Good. You're taking my final question away here, Greg. Stop at the moment. I want to press you on one more thing, and that is, here it is. Even if you're about to repeat yourself, tell us specifically about the role of an encryption and identity, particularly with digital certificates, that is going to help in achieving and maintaining compliance for the DSS.
Sure. So in fintech, financial technology, financial services, we have a long history of KYC, know your customer, right? How do you know who your customer is, right? In the online world, if a customer is ultimately represented by an email address, which could be anything, how do you know your customer? And the underlying sense of that is, how do you know the reputation of who you're doing business with?
Right.
In banking, financial services, we go through, again, we get tons of complaints. Well, I don't got to fill out this paperwork, because we want to know who you are. We want to know what your reputation is. We want to know that you're a good actor in this payment ecosystem. So for any business, right, how do you know who's knocking on your door on your website, and how do you know that they're a good guy or a malicious actor, or someone that you don't want to talk to at all, or someone that you really want to embrace, roll out the red carpet for? So identity management is really the only way you have to do that in the online world. Certificates can play a role in that, in answering that question for you.
Absolutely, and this is it's almost like being online it's almost a faceless world, and like we did here, names to faces, it's an important thing, and you use that function of identity to achieve that.
Right.
That's fantastic. Now, before we move on to the next compliance area on our agenda, we want to make sure that you're in the right place and you know what to do. So this is obviously a live panel discussion on the three most common compliance areas that's faced by our customers, you. And this discussion is presented by DigiCert. I'd like to remind everybody watching and listening that we would love to receive your questions the moment that they pop into your mind. That means right now. And even if they don't come into you right now, plug them in later once you think of them. And we want you to use the BrightTalk interface to pose any question that you would like answered. And the busy bees that are on the other side of the camera lens over there are going to tee them up for our panelists, who will be answering them live in a few minutes. Now we're going to move on to another topic area here, and this is going to be a fun one. For all of you Americans in the audience, you've heard the acronym HIPAA for years, and that's been since 1996 to be exact. Yet with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, it's still a hot topic, and that's over 20 years after it was passed, because it provides data privacy and security provisions for safeguarding medical information. And that's way more than the mere name implies. So as a result, organizations which handle healthcare information are particularly sensitive to achieving and maintaining HIPAA compliance. So we're going to turn over to Mark for some additional insights. Now, Mark, we come fresh off of Greg, who's throwing around terms like fintech and KYC, and that's in addition to PCI DSS. And here I go, I just untangled, or hopefully I didn't mangle, the HIPAA acronym. Tell us in a nutshell, what is HIPAA, and this is 20 years on.
Well, you did a great job of taking care of the acronym, but I'll repeat it just in case. Healthcare Insurance Portability Accountability Act, right? So HIPAA. And potentially highly complex. There are really two segments of it that are particularly interesting from a compliance perspective. One is privacy, making sure that that a patient is able to authorize the exchange of their information, the sharing of their information. The second part is about security. It's about the physical, the administrative, the electronic controls around electronic personal healthcare information. So two aspects of it, privacy aspect and a security aspect.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for framing it up that easily. It's easy, definitely for our audience to swallow when you got into camps and as you characterize it, and make sure I got it right, like the acronym, sharing of information, but also the security controls.
Correct.
Fantastic. So here we are 20 years past HIPAA becoming real. Has there been evolution, and how well is it being implemented within the healthcare industry?
Well, in the early days, not so well at all. But in 2009, you started to see the mandatory breach disclosures come online. So you started to see more audits. You started to see more fines being leveled, the enforcement being stepped up. And that was good, but we still have a lot of ways to go. We still see breaches, we still see fines and things like that are indicators of not quite to the level of maturity that organizations in the healthcare industry need to be.
Okay, constantly chasing that dot and understanding everything. Especially, I'm sure, as the ecosystem, the nature and flavor and rapidity of attacks happen, it opens up new dimensions, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that recently has happened is that it's transitioned from just a compliance and regulatory need imperative, which is important by itself, but we've seen a couple of very high-level breaches and impacts of that that have raised it to the business level and not just kind of in the corner of compliance.
Right.
So for instance, recently there was a WannaCry breach that locked down the operations of 48 hospitals in the UK with the NHS organization. And suddenly it's not just about ticking these compliance boxes, which are important. This is about fundamentally the lives of patients and the revenue of an organization and the ability to operate. There's a real business impacts, and that's the type of thing that's brought it to a board level now.
Got it. And that's one of the things, if you've noticed in our discussions, whether in this panel or other presentations that we've made, is to elevate beyond the lawyers and the data and the IT and IS people, because there's always business aspects to what's going on in the security world, especially with regards to compliance. And it really sheds a new light on how compliance should be viewed and used. It could be a tool for a business to stay healthy. Are there other changes to HIPAA or beyond it that would affect how healthcare providers approach security, that security aspect you mentioned?
Well, the security aspect, cybercrime has become a lot more sophisticated. It's been, it's just the complexity is just much more to the forefront.
Okay, and we've seen that. We've been paying attention, of course, every year Symantec releases its Internet Security Threat Report. We love to look through that information, keep aware. I know Symantec provides it for free. And the ISTR, as we in the industry like to call it, the healthcare sector was one of the most affected by cybercrime. And could you provide for the audience why, and then what are the associated challenges that we've seen from that?
So I just want to point out, in this particular case, since HIPAA is roughly 15 years old, right, it's really only this century. In payment card, right, you have economic data. In HIPAA, you have some economic data and some sensitive data. But you see in the industry, right, since it's all dependent on computers and technology, right, why did the health industry get attacked so successfully so recently, right? Because their maturity model is not as mature as the financial services model, because they haven't been wrestling with it as long. So it's a perfect illustration of that hard target concept, right? Where do the malicious actors go to get valuable data? They go to the places that are the weaker targets or are not as mature on their mitigations and their controls.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's reference to the ISTR report, which we've got a new one coming out in about 2 months. Right. But the reason for targeting healthcare, that's one of the main factors, is that it is not one of the more mature industries when it comes to the sophistication in protections. And if you take, that further back in the maturity model with kind of the rich data that's there from patient information to payment information, potentially intellectual property with foundations and research areas, and then you lay on top of that the complexity of the IT infrastructure, because you've got a lot of different insurance places, you've got organizations that deal with the administration, with actual payments, you've got clinics, you've got distributed doctors, and so you've got this very complex set of infrastructure. Layer onto that, new devices that are networked in the Internet of Things world, and that nexus of those three areas of complex IT, of monetizable information, and an industry that is a couple steps behind the best in class, that's what makes it a ripe target.
Got it, understood. And it's common sense for any attacker. They're going to go where it's easy to attack. I love to use the analogy when someone's walking down, they see two cars on the street, and one of them has a little red flashing light on the dash and the other one doesn't. Guess which one is going to be the one more apt to be broken into? So this deterrence aspect is not only in readiness and prevention, but it's also somewhat of sending a signal out there of you're not going to be successful here, and perhaps compliance, we could talk about this a little later when we get to you, Ben, is that deterrence factor goes also not only to stop the crime, but also send other people, go look somewhere else in a weaker organization.
Right.
Great. So obviously there's a lot of nuances and a lot of complexity in the whole equation here. I'm sure there are some best practices. Could you comment on what would be the best practices for an organization watching right now to be compliant with HIPAA?
Well, I think, again, there's the privacy and compliance, and there's security controls. And I think sometimes the best step that can be taken is to first take a step back and look at the top down of look at your exposures, look at where the most important information is, and then you can do a kind of a risk-adjusted plan. Instead of it being this big, you can pare it down. Excuse me, didn't mean to get my hands in your face, but pare it down so that you can focus on the most critical areas of exposure, to start. Right. And that can help set your priorities. Because let's face it, we don't have, nobody has unlimited budgets. And a lot of times you need to do that risk-based assessment, your priorities, and then go to get the funding, right? Get the staffing in place, get the funding in place, but have a step plan that addresses the highest risk areas first, right? And
excellent.
That's what we've seen critical, because now you do have that opportunity at the board level to kind of reset the conversation, but you have to do it in a way that's planned, and you have to have a governance infrastructure to manage that plan to fruition. And then the last part is that starting to get the organizationally, culturally changed, get all of the employees bought into how important this is,
right,
and being active participants in security. Because guess what, if you've got an organization of 10,000, 20,000 people, and they're all looking out for things that look strange, boy, that's a multiplier effect that you can really put into place and gain benefits from.
It's so unsung. We think about it all the time that machines don't attack each other, maybe even botnets and what have you, but there's always a human behind it. Well, we often forget there's a human on the other side of that too. So getting that awareness and that security mindset, we know from both of our organizations that's key to maintaining and achieving compliance. So I appreciate all the insights. By now, you've been clearly dazzled by all the insights that our three subject matters so far have provided. And that's regarding compliance with GDPR and then the PCI DSS and with HIPAA. But our objective isn't, of course, for you to be smitten with them and the information they're providing. We want you to be enabled to take action on compliance matters, which might affect you, even if you're subject to compliance matters that we haven't even covered in this topic role. So with that, it's logical to save the most action-oriented section of today's discussion for the last of our experts. And for that, we're going to turn to Ben, who is all about implementing effective compliance programs in his organization, of which I'm part. Ben, first of all, welcome again. And how is it that how do you start for everybody watching here? How do you begin forming an effective compliance program?
Well, as has already been mentioned, it's important to get buy-in from everyone in the organization, and starting at the top. it's been called the tone at the top, or sometimes it's more the conduct at the top, because you want to have the leaders show by example, that they have ethical conduct. You start with an environment of ethics and compliance, and it makes it a lot easier. So as you adopt policies and procedures, one of the important policies, an overarching policy, is a company code of conduct. And you can have those even if you're a small organization. It can be, a lot of companies have their slogan or their motto, but it's also good to have a compliance-oriented motto or slogan, so that you have then a code of conduct. It can be a written document that starts, sort of a rainfall approach to having all the policies and procedures in place that help you get into compliance for your particular industry. So whether it's, if you're just dealing with data from EU citizens, what do you have to do? You start writing, you identify those risks, and you write your policy and procedures to address those risks. Right. So that's important. That's how you get started, is by starting with a code of conduct or a tone at the top, and then having the policies and procedures.
For me, that was an unexpected answer, because here we are talking about all the things that you need to do to meet a certain flavor of compliance here. And really the messages that I heard come across there were ones of leadership,
right.
that the body follows the head, but also then a culture. It's an acculturation thing. And if you think this way, then it becomes easier to become compliant in other areas, because that's already the way it's part of the culture and the DNA of the organization. Is that true?
Right, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So then this kind of bleeds into the next question I would have, and that is ease of implementation of a program, or how hard it is. Can you give us some comments on that?
Yeah. So I like to point people out to the U.S. sentencing guidelines.
Okay.
And people think, well, what does that have to do with compliance? Why
go there?
Why would I worry about those kinds of things?
Would we know sentencing guidelines?
And,
Hold on.
And we got all of our attention. Ben.
This is a different demographic.
It's not for the person that's caught with drugs on their possession, and
Okay.
how long do they have to go into prison? But there's also a set for organizations, and so a section of the sentencing guidelines, section 2. I think it's 8B2, I think, or 2B8, yeah.
We won't quote you. It's not
It's
like
one
we're
of those.
live or anything.
If
or
you
being
do a
recorded.
Google or a search on the internet for effective compliance program, you're bound to run into it. And that's the one key takeaway I want people to remember is effective compliance program.
Okay. That
search query will lead you to those sentencing guidelines. And the advantage of that is that it's the de facto roadmap for creating an effective, and a lot of my discussion today is going to have I've got my guidance from those, and so that's sort of, but back to your question. I wanted to introduce that because it gives context to the rest of what I want to talk about. Okay. And that is that there's not one size fits all, and that's recognized by the sentencing guidelines. That you can make it as hard or as difficult as you want, and that you should have policies and procedures and action in place that you implement, that you work on towards your compliance program, and the size of it will depend on the particular industry that you're in, whether you're subject to government regulations, and how big you are as a company, and then on a risk assessment. That was mentioned a little earlier. You tailor your program and your conduct towards a risk assessment where you balance out the risks, which are the likelihood that some kind of non-compliance is going to happen, with the potential damage that could happen. And you multiply those together, and that becomes your risk score. And then you rank all of your risk scores, and it can be done on a simple, 2-column spreadsheet,
right.
3-column spreadsheet. and then you address, you put your resources, you balance it's a risk-based resource allocation based on what your risks are. And that helps. And then doing that, if you've done that, you have that as evidence of compliance. So if somebody then later on comes in, like under the sentencing guidelines, if your company becomes the subject of some kind of enforcement action, whether it's civil or criminal, even in a civil case, you can hold up your risk assessment and say, we were doing our best to address these risks.
Okay, we talked about earlier, work towards something helps, especially when you get called in front of the business end of the sentencing guidelines.
Yeah, and you should do it once a year, or depending on the size and the complexity of your organization, either once a year or less often or more often, depending on that.
Okay.
So I'll give you a really simple way. Like, you're a small business, medium-sized business, and you want to motivate senior leadership, and you go and you talk about Red Hat and Windows and middleware and stuff, and their eyes just glaze over. But do exactly what you say, but make it simple, right? In the world of HIPAA, the records are more complicated, but in my world, we have a lot of data that says $3 a card. So if you lose control of a card number, $3. So exactly like you said, do the math, right? How many cards do you have in that system? 1 million, 2 million, right? $3 a card, they all disappear. That's, on average, that's what's going to cost you. That usually gets the attention of the senior executives, and then they say, okay, what do I got to do to protect that? And then you come in and you say, well, I need this, I need that, I need the other thing, and they can relate to it. And
yeah,
it comes
and
home.
The tone of the top, part of that is the understanding of the importance of it, and then the risk, and then you get the resources that you want. You want to be able to call on those resources, get the adequate funding, get enough autonomy in your compliance program where you can be doing these things when they come up.
Can I just add, like the risk you're talking about, monetary risk, things being stolen, what have you. We should also keep in mind the brand and reputational risk that organizations are subject to, and that has the attention of the executives as well, because it's something you have to protect. People need to feel like they can trust you as a business partner.
Yeah, I should have said, in our business, if you don't trust Visa, right, the whole industry falls apart. So that's one of the reasons that we invest so heavily. So I'm glad you brought that up. But even, in the healthcare field, right, trust is so critical. How could you not put that on the balance sheet? So when you're doing that, I talk about $3 a card, that gets people's attention, but brand risk, you say, okay, what is the value of all these negative headlines because we lost control of our data? How do you quantify that? But I don't know how to quantify that in any broad way, but I know that everybody I say it to, when they all of a sudden they think about it, they're like, oh yeah, that would be really bad. We don't want to do that.
Talk market cap. That
Yeah,
can make
right.
$3 million
Yeah.
look cheap, right?
That's
So,
right.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll give you a great example from today, right? And not to pick on healthcare, right? Amazon and Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, and Chase, Jamie Dimon, all got together and said, we're going to do healthcare. And what happened to the stock values of the largest insurance
Took a
companies,
cut,
right?
yeah.
They all took a haircut today. So this is tangible stuff. It's hard to calculate, but it's real.
Right. So on that intangible, I was making some notes as you were all talking, and you're bringing up terms like reputation and leadership and culture, and these are all very human things to do that you wouldn't expect from sentencing guidelines. And here's what the compliance tick list is. So, Ben, as a follow-up to the question, I'm sure the group could join in more. What more, especially in that human aspect, can be done or needs to be done in order to let me get the phrasing correct, implement an effective compliance program?
Well, earlier on in the discussion, I talked about having a code of conduct and having policies and procedures. And you can't just, and having the conduct and the tone at the top, you can't have just those things because, for instance, you can put the code of conduct on a shelf and no one would ever look at it. So what you have to do is you have to communicate with everyone in the company. It's an ongoing process. Nothing is static. You can't just let something sit somewhere and not feed it. You have to keep feeding it. And so training and communication are part of an effective program. And that means making sure people are aware of what their responsibilities are.
Yes.
So they're accountable, and following up on things, and then refreshing their memories on what their duties and responsibilities are, and to just always be like some data breaches will happen because somebody forgot to reset the default password on a server or something like that. You want to be able to, like, if somebody is thinking about those kinds of things, they will remember, if you have the policies and procedures and they're aware of them, not to leave the default passwords active on the servers.
Again, with the culture, it becomes practice. It's so many different dimensions, but they all point towards the same thing. So I have to ask the question, for a effective compliance program, what happens if it's not effective and the compliance program fails?
Well, failure is what is the cause of the failure? So you might want to do a root cause analysis to try and get to the failure, and then usually if you do that, you'll notice that it's one of two things. Either your program and your policies, your procedures, and your education weren't effective enough, and you've got to improve those, or it was a bad actor that refuses to follow those, and they were just. So obviously, disciplinary action in that case, but if it's not, if it's just common negligence or policies and procedures, then it's you revisit. It's again this continual cycle. It's like a Deming plan, do, check, act, or check, adjust process, where and what that cycle is, whether it's a monthly cycle or an annual cycle, depends on the organization again. But you have to do it right when you notice that there's something wrong. Because back to the sentencing guidelines.
Right.
The sentencing guidelines, and there's lots of documentation around those, state that recurrence of a similar misconduct creates the doubt that the organization was taking to due regard for and took reasonable steps to meet the requirements of the guidelines. So it's sort of they're very in tune with that thing, of knowing it's bad. It'd be bad evidence to see that your organization was repeatedly failing to do something important.
Fantastic advice. And I regret we're going to have to skip a follow-up question that I have just in the interest of time. We're moments away from all of our experts fielding your questions, and I'd like to take the opportunity to remind you of your opportunity to use the BrightTalk interface to type in any questions that you want answered by our panelists. And I want to move on to the final round of discussion. We're going to call this the lightning round, and I'm going to hold our panelists' feet to the fire here when I'm going to ask them for a single solitary minute and no more. What is the one most important thing that you should take away from today's discussion? And as before, we're going to start with Brenda. Brenda, you got 1 minute. What's the most important thing that people should take away from what you've covered?
I think it's a matter of preparedness. Understand compliance is something that you have to keep in mind and plan for, because like I said in the segment on GDPR, know your data, know your customers' data, understand the risks, what measures do you have in place.
Yep.
And I think as long as you can be prepared, you can show that as a defensible position actually, then I think you've done what you can. So I think knowing what you have.
Excellent. Now I'm realizing that as we're going through this, we're going to have some repetition here, and that's okay. So Greg's up next. Greg, you've got 1 minute. What is the one takeaway that we want our audience to take away from what you've covered?
So I may be a little more geeky than most, but at the end of the day, dealing with this stuff, you control access, you encrypt, which is another form of controlling access, or you remove the data entirely. So when you're training people, say, okay, you're in charge of data, how do you control access? Are you appropriately getting rid of the data that you don't need? And are you encrypting the stuff that you're going to keep for a long time, which is effectively another way of controlling access. Right. So, always go back to the baselines. Like, what are you doing to protect the data? Do you need that data? And then on an ongoing basis, are you managing it, responsibly over time? And that's really at the heart of what you do to manage the culture and the compliance and the thoughts about risk in your organization.
Fantastic. Okay, so we move onward to Mark. Mark, you've got the 1 minute. What's the one takeaway?
Well, since you just said encryption, I had two, so now I'm down to one,
Sorry.
and that's no, that's great because I don't have to cover that. Identity validation is absolutely critical. When I look at healthcare, when I sign into my websites to do things, I don't get two-factor authentication, right? I checked just this morning just to make sure that those organizations had valid website certificates from Symantec, now part of DigiCert, and that makes me feel good. But there are other parts of how do you secure Internet of Things devices? How do you validate that those devices should be on your network?
Yes.
How do you validate access and identity of kind of super users in the administration world who have access to thousands of consumer information? So identity validation is a critical part paired with encryption to making sure that data keeps and stays secure.
Excellent. And Ben, you're last up. Give us your 1 minute, and what's the takeaway for our audience from everything that's been covered?
Yeah, well, the takeaway is that you should do a search online and continue your education in this area for the phrase effective compliance program, and look for the U.S. Sentencing Guidelines guidance. It's there are maybe 10 steps that we've covered today that you can refresh and get into more detail on, and just use, look for other resources that can help you do those things.
Right, there's so many people that have, organizations that are already tripped over their feet, and there's a lot of learning from there, especially if the advice is Google it. The term is, of course, effective compliance programs. Let's not all, we can't forget that. So that wraps up the lightning round, and it's now time to move on to answering the questions that you've submitted. We've got about, by the look of the clock, just over 5 minutes to do so. So as each of these compliance areas are the ones that you're most concerned with, we have received some very good questions. So we're going to get over to answering them. And if we could click onward here, then I think I could see some of those questions. Right. And I see the first one that's come in is regarding HIPAA. So Mark, this is going to go up your alley. Has HIPAA helped to improve protection of health information?
I'll do a very qualified small yes. I'd want to say no, but it's helped, but there's still such a long way to go because cyber attacks are becoming more sophisticated. Right. The stakes are higher. It's not, compliance is important, but fundamental availability. So it's gotten better, but there's a long way to go. Okay,
great. Appreciate that. Next, I see that the question has come in with regards to the GDPR, and for this, we'll turn to Brenda. The question, if I can, again, oh boy, here comes acronyms, so I hope I don't mangle them. We have ISO 27001 certification, at least the person asking the question. Do they need to refer to the GDPR? How are they interrelated?
Yes, although ISO 27001 will provide a good foundation for GDPR, it won't be sufficient in and of itself because GDPR has many, many other facets. Okay. So it's a good starting point, but you really have to look deeper into GDPR regulations.
Okay, great. That intersection is not going to get you all the way there for either one of them, it sounds like. Okay, great. So looking at the clock, we've got time for, looks like 1 or 2 more questions. So this one's going to be about PCI. So we're going to turn to Greg. Greg, it's your turn up. What are the penalties for PCI non-compliance?
Oh boy.
Sentencing guidelines.
That's right, sentencing guidelines.
Yeah,
Google it.
It's not sentencing guidelines. Really, it's the threat to your business, right? If you are a bad actor with your card data, the card networks will turn you off. Wow. And so think about that as the percentage of your payment volume that comes through cards. If you are a bad actor and payment cards are no longer a way for you to get paid, what does that do to your business? Yes, there's a schedule of fines and this sort of thing if you're a really bad actor, but really it's fundamentally your business. If people aren't confident paying for stuff that you're selling with a card, right? What does that do to your business? That should be enough motivation by itself.
I want to come back to there's something I've said for years, and that is a forgotten aspect of security is trust. And that's something that we all feel from no matter where we are and what you need to be compliant with, and that is especially with what Greg said, people are willing or not to give you their money. And as organizations, that's a business aspect we all need to pay attention to. And if that doesn't get the board's attention, I don't know what would. I think we're going to do one more by the looks of time. So looks like, Brenda, this one's for you. What about data storage and data hosting when using U.S. service providers, and will they have to comply with the GDPR?
Absolutely.
Oh boy.
If they are doing business with EU citizens, and they're offering goods or services, they are subject to this. And it's important to understand what safeguards are in place at these businesses. Are they protecting your data appropriately? Are they taking the proper technology and organizational measures that the regulations call for? So definitely look at those service providers and ensure that what you're getting out of it is compliant.
Okay, great. So I'm looking at the clock here, and I'm going to squeak one in here. So this is, Mark, we're going to have to answer this quickly here because it looks like it's a HIPAA-related question. And are there other acts or regulations similar to HIPAA, and this is outside of the U.S.?
Yes, Canada's done it, taken a similar approach. When you look at GDPR, it's also about protection of personal information. So there are a lot of overlapping constructs across the country, or across the world, really. And so wherever you are, you're likely to have data security, data privacy issues with personal identifiable information, whether it's healthcare or other aspects.
Okay. And then one thing also is states. There's also state laws if you're in the
Right.
United States, or I don't know if Canada has provincial laws, but it's almost like it is another country. So some states are, you wonder sometimes, but
Okay, got it. I think we are completely out of time. So thank you to our panelists here, and hopefully you are full of new insights. And this is courtesy, of course, of Brenda and Greg and Mark and Ben, but we are now out of time. So that's going to wrap up today's discussion. But I want to remind you that only the content for today is over, and you still have some work to do before you click away to go implement all the things that you've learned today. Now, first, if you haven't rated this briefing and provided comments, please do so now. The same goes for any questions that are left unanswered. We're not going to be able to answer them, and we will do so offline if you haven't submitted that question. So please do so anyway. Now, second, we want to strongly encourage you to actively continue today's conversation with your account manager and all the others supporting you across the DigiCert organization. Now, please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers into those conversations, much like we've done with our panel here. And now, finally, we ask you to share this briefing with your peers and your direct reports and your leadership and anybody who couldn't attend but you think would benefit from it. Now, the recording will be ready quite soon, and anybody can access it in perpetuity using the very same URL that got you here today. So with that, thank you again for your time and for your participation in today's discussion. And on behalf of all four of our panelists, and equally on behalf of DigiCert, goodbye, good day, stay compliant, and stay safe online.